So what we're going to watch tonight is called Across Canada with Ford. And we're going to be seeing a slightly edited, cut down version of a 1925 documentary that Ford Canada put together for, among other things, their 21st birthday, and also to advertise the launch of the 1926 Ford Model T, what they called the new Ford. This is a documentary made in cooperation with the Canadian National Railways, primarily Canadian Pacific Rail. And the idea was to attempt a crossing of Canada with a vehicle under its own power, specifically a Ford Model T driving the whole distance. Now, crucially, they didn't do the whole trip on roads. About just under a quarter of the trip was actually done by rail. So there's going to be a great deal of railway content in this video. It's completely silent, there's no audio, and we have reason to believe this may have been designed actually as a narrated film, something that would be shown sort of as a slideshow, exactly like I'm doing now, with a narrator talking over it. So a quick intro. We know a lot about this drive, and there's a lot we don't know about this drive. We know the participants. It was primarily a team of three people. Ford filmographer Ed Flickenger, who, as far as we know, never actually shows up in the film. Ford PR rep JLS Scrymgeour, who was the sort of press representative but didn't actually do the whole trip. And then a rotating cast of hangers-on and local drivers and Ford representatives who did most of the actual technical stuff. So there's the car. It's a new Ford. It's a 1926 Ford Model T built in Windsor. And it starts out from Halifax. Now, there's been some sort of controversy about this trip. Does it count as a drive across Canada if a large portion of the drive was made on rails? I'm not really going to, discuss that in much detail. That's sort of up to you. Incidentally, that's Scrymgeour there in the glasses. You'll see him more later. But what this is the third, as far as we know, serious attempt to cross Canada, and the first one ever actually done under vehicle power the whole way. The previous two, most prominently Wilby and Haney's trip in 1912, involved a lot of shipping things by rail and a lot of boat travel, but this one is actually a car driving across Canada. You'll notice also the phrase Trans-Canada comes up a lot. The idea of a trans-Canadian highway following something like this route that they're tracing, and you'll notice, sorry, no Toronto, they didn't go in Southern Ontario at all. That had been proposed in the 1910s, actually by what would become the British Columbia branch of the CAA. And this idea of a trans-Canadian highway or a trans-Canada highway really stuck around for a very long time until the 1950s when it was actually realized. It's a very, very old idea that dates back almost to the beginnings of driving in Canada. And as they start off, the maritime portion of this trip was definitely the easiest. Perry Doolittle, who more on him later, called the Maritimes a paradise for drivers. There was a very active contingent of regular American car tourists into the Maritimes, so there was a great deal of financial incentive to make good roads. And this is actually a time period when roads in Canada are in fairly poor shape, largely actually due to train travel. The Canadian railway network was so elaborate and so successful at this point that it was really disincentivizing building of roads between cities. The Canadian road network in the early 1800s had been pretty good, and then the moment the train came along, it basically fell apart because all that transport money went back into the railways. Now, these stops here in Truro and I believe in Moncton are following sort of a standard format you'll see throughout the film. They would stop, have kind of a public reception with the local Ford dealers, and the mayor of whatever town they were passing through would sign a big decorative scroll thing. We don't know the exact format. There are some rough screenshots of it in the film. Crucially, it hasn't survived. In fact, basically none of the sort of souvenirs and memorabilia and very little of the media coverage from this trip has survived to the present day, barring some of the Automotive Association badges you'll see occasionally on the front of that Model T. So we'll go through a whole laundry list of Canadian mayors of 1925, most of whom, frankly, I don't know very much about. But all in all, this video is a spectacular portrait of just travel in general in Canada circa 1925. It's a really fascinating mix of, well, like you can see here in Montmagny, pedestrian traffic, car traffic, horse-drawn traffic, railways, streetcars, bicycles. It's a time when travel in Canada took a lot wider variety of means and was a little bit more chaotic than it is nowadays. Great view of old Quebec here. So you'll notice everywhere they go, they're driving on gravel highways. Gravel was the gold standard, sort of the industry best practice of good, cost-effective highway building back in the day. Asphalt technology was around, but it was prohibitively expensive, especially in terms of maintenance. And this is a time when only tiny chunks of the Canadian road network are government maintained. Most of them are municipal or individually owned. But there are big public works projects like the Pont de Quebec, which had just been completed in 1919, of course, still in use today. Back then, it was a railway bridge and an expensive and complicated one that had had several major collapses during its construction. I believe they started building it in 1903. So this was a major piece of Canadian infrastructure at the time. Um, and here we introduce Dr. Doolittle, Dr. Perry Doolittle specifically. He was a competitive cyclist and car nut who ended up becoming one of Canada's most prominent early travel writers and motorcycle enthusiasts and car enthusiasts. He was a founding president of the CAA, and he was the biggest lobbyist for a Trans-Canada Highway. He didn't live to see a Trans-Canada Highway, but his proposals and his route were basically what was followed well up into the 1950s. And here he is driving that one Ford directly across the Pont Quebec. Now, by partial planning and happy coincidence, the 1926 Model T Ford and all the Model T Fords had a track width almost identical to the standard Canadian railway gauge. So these kinds of quick conversions of Fords into railway speeders were ubiquitous. You'll see a few others later on in the film owned by, it's a little unclear whether they're CN Rails speeders or Ford speeders, but they show up a lot. But here, Doolittle is doing some of the only driving he did in this entire trip. There's sort of a common misconception that was actually started sort of accidentally by Ford back in the 70s that Doolittle did the entire drive himself. Completely untrue. He did almost none of the driving except for this stretch. But he was misrepresented in the press as having been the driver. He was 64 years old at this time, and while he was an enthusiastic driver, he wasn't, that's him on the left there, he wasn't quite up for an entire drive across Canada. So he did most of the stretch to sort of the Quebec leg, then returned home back to Toronto. He kind of helped plan long distance, and then would rejoin the trip in Dryden. We'll see him later. But yeah, some great shots of Quebec and of the kind of toll roads that existed back in the day and still exist in Quebec, albeit a little bit more modernized. So again, you'll see roads out here in Eastern Canada are in pretty good shape. They don't have to do any serious railway travel here, aside from crossing the bridge, and that's arguably more of a publicity stunt. I'm also always intrigued at the level of traffic and which of these shots are staged versus spontaneous. There's large parts of this film that have obviously been set up, and large parts where it's kind of hard to tell, and we don't have enough detail to know for sure. Crucially, here we see a bit more traffic and roadside tourism. This is a theme that's going to come up a ton in this movie. This is a time when the Canadian provinces are really realizing that roadside tourism can be very lucrative. And you'll see a ton more of it sort of doubling down on this idea of roadside attractions by the highways and scenic highways, a ton out in Alberta and British Columbia. But at this point, yeah, they're basically, they said their goal wasn't particularly speed, but to head as west as possible, sort of due west as they could, hence no detour into Southern Ontario. Montreal, of course, a big car city at the time. They'd had a few small car builders, loads of railway building and train building. And some interesting shots of highway construction. Here's some pretty large scale constructing of a gravel highway. I've driven this highway nowadays. It's often that bumpy. And an interesting shot coming up actually of the Parliament buildings. I suspect the reason you'll see they use still photos of the Parliament buildings is they were actually still under construction at this point. You'll recall the original Parliament buildings had burned down in 1916, and by 1925 the new ones weren't finished yet. They'd done the exteriors, but most of the Peace Tower and Center Block were actually a hollow shell. And then back out to Carleton Place for some more delightful horse content. Believe it or not, the amount and rate of horse ownership in Canada was still climbing at this point, even though cars were still taking over. It wasn't actually until the 30s and 40s that cars finally overtook horses in terms of ownership in Canada. And that's largely due to growing rural populations and commercial agriculture. So you're going to see a lot of horses sort of commingling and interacting with cars throughout this film, especially in rural areas. Incidentally, that previous shot was taken about 10 minutes walk away from where I was married, which is fun. But yeah, these street scenes are amazing. Just the bustlingness, the crossing of sidewalks and road, the mix of traffic, the occasional pile of horse poop. It's wild. Um, Incidentally, it's neat that they go through Petawawa because the Canadian Army was actually only just starting to use lots of motor vehicles at this time. They only really started adopting trucks in about 1920. And this highway north of Petawawa that they call Elemental Country was so famously bad it became a point of contention in Parliament over whether it was a national embarrassment for its bumpiness and dustiness. You often see pictures of people bundled up for driving back in the day, and in the summertime, most of that protection was necessary just to deal with mud and dust. Even towns like North Bay here could be ankle deep in a mix of mud and horse poop, depending on how much the local population still used horses. Now, one of the interesting things you'll see here is in between North Bay and Sturgeon Falls, the road suddenly gets really good again. And you'll see that in a few places. And the answer is actually the logging industry. Roads were often very well maintained in places where there were economic reasons to maintain them well. And northwestern Ontario, with huge amounts of logging, was road building central even before the automotive days to get all those logs out. You'll see some more sort of heavy industrial logging areas later on that have excellent roads. Another neat shot, the only night shot we get here. The new Fords were fairly notable for having full electric headlights, though a flaw in them was that the power was tied directly to the speed of the motor. If you drove too fast, you could actually burn your headlights out. Fun fact. Now, another sort of theme that shows up a lot in this is places, sort of national tourist sites and big industrial national tourist sites, places that tend to be near major avenues of transportation. So you'll see the locks here. You'll see some more in Winnipeg and Vancouver, and more signing of the big old scroll. As always, a lot of these people who are holding the scrolls and presenting them, we have to assume they're local Ford dealers. We just don't know. The amount of official documentation on this trip is borderline nil. What we do know about it has been effectively reconstructed from newspaper accounts. And now we start to get into bad road country, doing a very good job of showing off just how bendy the frame of a Ford Model T was. But crucially, the one thing they don't film anywhere in this process, and to a degree, I can understand why not. This is effectively advertising. Never once do we see somebody have to get out and push. But this is just the beginning of 2,000-ish miles of poor to non-existent roads. This area in northwestern Ontario specifically was a real bugaboo for people attempting to drive across Canada, both before and after, well into the late 1940s. The highways up here were questionable at best, sort of past Sault Ste. Marie up into the Kenora, eastern side of Manitoba area. And now we get to Algoma, and if I'm not mistaken, we get our first, yeah, Steelton here, the first extended bit of driving on the rails. Now, it's a little unclear. This is probably a CN Rail pilot car. Later on, we see multiple cars driving on the rails that are not the same CN Rail car. It's a little vague at times whether or not there were two cars in the trip, or at some points even three. There may have been some variation, but it certainly made for some pretty spectacular driving. Another thing that's worth remembering, a Ford Model T is not particularly fast, but most of the time you wouldn't be able to get it up to 70 or 80 kilometers per hour on the roads because the roads were so bumpy. Being on a rail like this, being on a smooth, flat surface, theoretically meant you could really crank it on these cars. And we don't see a ton of evidence of really high-speed driving on this trip, but they were certainly capable of doing it. I mentioned logged out country. Here is some seriously logged out country with a railway running right through it, of course. You'll see lots of sort of evidence of logging going through this the next few minutes. Note some trains carrying lumber too. And our first close encounter with a railway full of wood. Um, the train or the car was actually registered, as it'll mention a bit later, as a train with Canadian Pacific. It was a dedicated special. So it had partial right of ways, it had siding access. It could basically they could go on and off the railway whenever they needed to, without too much trouble, as long as they followed roughly their schedule and communicated with the railway authorities. Ed Flickenger definitely got some seriously intense filmmaking going on. He was Ford's cinematographer for going on almost 30 years, and so he was quite an experienced cameraman well in the 1920s. And there's definitely a few parts of this film where he takes a moment to show off. And this shot is pretty darn close to one of them. Another neat thing on the theme of tourist sites, Agawa Canyon here in northwestern Ontario is still to this day only accessible by rail. It's remote and rugged enough that there is not full highway access to it. So it gives you an idea, of the intensity of the terrain they're crossing through. That even, you know, more than 100 years later, some of these spots are still not car accessible. And then comes the weather. There'll be a running theme in the latter two-thirds of this trip of just appallingly bad weather the whole time. This was theoretically like a pleasant mid to sort of early to mid fall trip, but they got terrible, terrible weather the whole way through across the Rockies. Snow and rain, some really unseasonably bad rain. You'll notice people start to get very, very bundled up even when they're outside the car going forward, and a lot of rain and mud. More train dodging. They got a lot of good shots of trains going by. And the famous scheduling board shot that shows they were the Ford Special Halifax to Vancouver. And they were running on time, although credit where it's due, they didn't actually have a fixed schedule. Their intent was again to go in no hurry and just see how long it took. And they had a lot of fun with stage shots like this one. The car pulling into the station. I would love to know more about the backstory of how this was filmed and how this was organized, because clearly in some places the whole town came out to see the car drive by in the train. And in other places they just sort of whizzed through without stopping. So moving across the Great Lakes, if you've ever driven or taken the train alongside Lake Superior, the rails are still there. This is a very familiar view and a very familiar landscape to anybody who's ever driven the Trans-Canada or ridden the Canadian along this part of the country. There is really sort of only one highway and one railway route through this chunk of Canada, and it existed back in 1925, and it still exists today. So here we see another good shot of this time they had a whole team of people. The number of people actually involved in the mechanical work on the car seems to be heavily variable depending on where they are, but they had, four people working and half a dozen people watching and providing color commentary. But it seems to have been a fairly easy process to change the wheels on and off. The figure I've seen quoted was 2 hours per wheel change. but that's a newspaper source from the end of the trip. I don't know how accurate that was to day to day. Also, of course, because this is a Ford promotional video, they drive by a roadway where they're using Fordson tractors, also made in Canada, to build a road. So we got to have a segment talking about how, hey, Fordson's building roads that Fords are driving across. This is advertising. I believe theoretically these tractors share some parts with Model Ts, but not in a way that I could easily identify off the top of my head. Also, keep an eye on the front grille of the Model T, the radiator there. You'll see the number of Automobile Association badges on the front of it steadily go up. I think we started the drive with one or two from Halifax, and by the end we'll have almost a dozen. So one of the problems with a trans-Canadian highway at this point was, again, highways and road building in general tended to be municipal, occasionally provincial, very rarely federal. So roads often existed only to the degree that the local municipality or the landowners thought there should be a road. Communities that were very big on cars tended to have big roads, and communities that were very big on the railway tended to have few to no roads at all, beyond tracks to get out to the outlying farms. So you'll see no consistency in the types of roads. It's really personal choice almost. And really, really cool shot in the big Ignace roundhouse here. This is, again, Flickenger showing off some cool cinematographical stuff. I really like this shot. I just think it's neat. And then right back off onto the rails again. Well, onto the siding at least. They clearly had to do a lot of hopping out of the car, manually switching points onto sidings, hopping back into the car. Possibly cars, plural. Again, it's not entirely clear how many vehicles they actually had for this trip. Now we've got box cars with a mix of passengers in the back. You will see trains representing basically every kind of cargo that could have been carried by train in Canada at this point. There's a staggering variety of trains in the same way there's a staggering variety in the quality of the roads. So in Dryden, we get a bit more of a hullabaloo because Perry Doolittle has rejoined the trip. He was already on his way out west for a CEA conference in Vancouver and decided, what the heck, I'll come along for some of the prairie section. He was, again, in his 60s, but had been a sort of well-known road lobbyist and public speaker and writer in Canada for more than 30 years at this point. So he was very much a nationally known celebrity. And his presence definitely added some sort of above corporate credibility to this trip. He was seen as kind of a nonpartisan advocate for better transportation in Canada in general. There's a lot of segments in these, especially the town segments. I wish we had somebody at the museum who knew to read lips very well. I would love to know what these people are saying in the few scenes where we can see their lips. So Kenora is going to represent the second time the trip runs out of road and has to backtrack. It happened more than once. Don't know who any of these gentlemen are. We haven't, or at least I haven't been able to find um, much newspaper detail from Kenora, but this is, I believe, the only time in the trip when a Canadian Pacific Railway official drives the train instead of a representative from Ford. Um, so again, there's a lot of kind of cross promotion going on between the two big companies here, who are theoretically rivals, but at this stage in the game, it's not so much that the highways are competing with the trains; it's they're both enabling each other. And Kenora was clearly a car town to some degree because they're building a highway, though with slightly lower technology than some of the previous places we've seen. These horses you'll often see in these road building scenes are dragging, they're literally carrying a big, heavy log of wood behind them to act sort of like a steamroller to flatten the road surface and compact the gravel. Again, this was not very high tech, but it was extremely popular and successful because it was so low tech. You could build roads good enough for cars without having to use a car. Oh, and we're up to five car club badges now from the original one. So the car's entry into Winnipeg was a fairly big deal. Mayor Webb was a huge car enthusiast. He was a member of the local automobile association. He really publicly feted or feted the idea of this trip. I mean, he drove out to meet them, which is something. There was also apparently a quite a large betting pool going around in Winnipeg proper as to when the car would arrive. The winner ended up receiving $25 when they pulled up in front of City Hall, which is quite a sum for 1925. So yeah, this was a well-recognized local event. The other interesting thing that they don't actually mention in well, we'll get to that in a second. Like Seven, you have Seven Sisters Falls, so you're about to see they're going to do some things with cars on Seven Sisters that I don't think you're allowed to do anymore. Namely, drive all over the falls in an automobile. And also, like you'll see some evidence of people having set up a fire pit or a couple fire pits on the big flat rocks, which again I'm not sure you're allowed to do anymore. It's a more lackadaisical approach to nature tourism back in the day, and more good demonstration of just how bendy that vanadium steel frame in a Model T was. That was a real asset for the kind of absolutely terrible road driving you've seen thus far, and the even worse roads that are going to be coming up as they cross the prairies. So Winnipeg at this point was a major industrial hub. One of the odd things that doesn't get mentioned in this film is that there was actually a fairly substantial Ford assembly plant in Winnipeg. It had been around since 1916, and it built exclusively, pretty much, Model T Fords like the one seen in this film. But this is a again more great, bustling 1920s street scenes with every possible mode of transportation imaginable, all mixed in together. This is before jaywalking had become a legal offense. And it's worth mentioning jaywalking is, of course, a term popularized by a consortium of American car companies to reduce the legal liability of drivers hitting pedestrians. But that's a story for another time. And now we get into gumbo. Gumbo is a classic sort of prairie Canadian term for really thick, sticky mud, often made thicker and stickier by layers of rotting grass and hay. Um, the plan apparently had been to leave Winnipeg immediately. We know from newspaper reports that Scrymgeour had bragged that he was aching for some hardship to write about. There was a terrible, unseasonable rainstorm for days and days and days. And some historians, including Mark Richardson in his book, The Drive Across Canada, which is a great source for talking about this film, have speculated that the Ford team were prevailed upon by Doolittle to actually delay their departure from Winnipeg until the weather had calmed down and the roads had dried out a bit, but keep publishing newspaper articles as if they'd left and were going through very stormy weather. Because what we see in the film 100% does not match up with what they reported in the papers, at least for this stretch of the road. And again, nobody ever gets out and pushes, not once, despite the quality of the roads. I also find it funny to keep an eye on when the car gets clean again. You can tell which were the cities that had car washing facilities available because the previously mud spattered car will suddenly get very, very shiny again before slowly becoming mud spattered again. These kinds of roads are one of the reasons why Canada used wooden-wheeled high-wheeler cars for a lot longer than other countries. Theoretically, a very long, narrow wagon-style wheel actually sinks through the gumbo and hits the solid stuff underneath. But certainly at the time, that this prairie driving was absolutely some of the worst driving available in Canada when the weather was wet. And here we have, of course, it's the prairies, our first grain train, of which there will be many later on. And approaching a big city, the roads get good again. We're back to gravel. So there's Scrymgeour again. I think not strictly accurate to call him the pilot. Again, he didn't do most of the driving and wasn't along for the whole trip. But he was presented to the press as the head of the expedition, and so by golly, he shows up in the film as the head of the expedition. More just lovely street scenes. So now we get into the really, really, really bad roads. Because now we've got snow and hail and freezing rain and ankle to knee deep mud. It's a testament to the fact that these roads were important that they were actually getting torn up this much. These were major sort of farming routes heading out of the big cities, but they were not state maintained. They were not municipally maintained, and they did indeed tend to be pretty catastrophic. Of course, also, freezing snow on the ground. Bear in mind, this car doesn't have a heater. It doesn't have a solid top. It's got sort of leatherette. So this would have been a pretty chilly time, even at the best of times. And this next section of a straw-covered road, this is a really interesting throwback to a very old sort of almost pioneer colonial days of road building, where you essentially just covered the wheel ruts with layers of rushes and straw that compacted down. Long term, didn't make for good road building, but in terms of getting your big Conestoga wagon or Prairie Schooner or Red River wagon across very bad ground, that's a technique that's going on 200 plus years old when this was filmed. So it shows how a lot of these sort of old school transportation technologies stuck around in Canada, even after there were better alternatives available simply because they were affordable. I also love how not at all remotely straight the road in this section is. An amazing zigzag going off into the distance, and these really astonishing mud puddles. Yeah, this whole stretch was basically continuous rain, or snow or sleet, as far as we can understand from the newspaper records. This was yeah, the what little we know from sort of personal information of the crew involved, everybody was tired and wet and miserable at this point. Yeah, try to pull 10 miles per hour in this kind of driving. But it's an interesting point because speed limits were a lot more arbitrary back in the day. They tended to be enforced town by town, and the strictness to which they were enforced and the timing to which they were enforced largely depended on the municipality. Towns that were more pro-car tended to have higher speed limits and be a lot less aggressive about enforcing speeding tickets, while very anti-car towns could often reduce their speed limits to as low as 3 or 4 miles per hour and do things like have single strike systems where if you sped once in a municipality, they were legally authorized to revoke your driver's license or take your car away. Um, that had, to a degree, calmed down in most of Canada by the 1920s, but there were still definitely large parts of the prairies that were quite firmly anti-car at this point. You can see if you look closely, Scrymgeour in this section is extremely muddy. I'm sure they all were. Kara, of course, is just painted with the stuff. So Lethbridge clearly liked cars, but only 8 miles worth of cars. Roads were expensive. They still are. Now, as we head toward the Rockies, and the sort of Calgary area, and especially west of Calgary, you're going to start to notice the roads get dramatically better. This is surprisingly, the Rocky Mountain crossing involves some of the least railway driving they did, though, as you can see here, the weather's still appalling. And the reason is actually national parks, but we'll get more to that in a second. Yeah, this is another spot where there might have been three cars in the convoy for the Calgary section. You can see three Model Ts with signs in the windows back to back to back. And we're up to seven, possibly eight or nine car club memberships in the front of the car. But it seems to have been variable, and we've not been able to find any period sources confirming the actual number of vehicles in the convoy. I wouldn't be surprised if it was two, with a third occasionally tacked on by somebody local for spare parts or the like. Did a few times where they had to replace axles that were damaged, and it would have made some sense to have a third car along to transport those kinds of parts with them. Yeah, everybody in this shot looks cold and kind of damp, which says a lot about the conditions they were going through. Few of these signature sections are highlighting the signatures of the mayors on the big scroll. Again, we cut out a few minutes from the beginning that just goes over what's in the scroll because, frankly, a bit of paperwork that hasn't existed for 100 years isn't particularly relevant to the cool railway and driving footage. So a road connection between Calgary and Banff had opened in about 1911, which is extremely early for a good Canadian road. And it was almost entirely due to the demands of ski and natural tourism, especially coming up from the United States. By 1920 or thereabouts, um, there had been a national park formed in Banff. Rocky Mountain Park. It became Banff National Park in 1930. So this meant that this is one of the only places in the entire country that actually had federally funded and federally maintained roads. As a result of which, at least from the east, the roads through the Rockies in this part of Alberta and further out in BC were about as good as they could get, solely because there was a dedicated person paying for them or a dedicated organization. So there we are, eight Automobile Association badges, and a nice buffalo. Banff was really, at this point, primarily a car town, as you'll see from the very wide and high quality roads and the right-of-way signs and parking. They'd opened up Banff to British Columbia connections in 1923. So this was one of the only parts of the country where you could do serious interprovincial driving in a tourist context relatively easily. Some editing weirdness here. So this is would have been what they called a four-reeler back in the day. A reel of silent film was almost exactly 15 minutes long, and this film total is a little over an hour. We suspect the original Library and Archives Canada scan of this was a scan of an already edited version of the film. There are some weird flickers and intercuts like we just saw. But here we are going up into the Rockies, and the roads, pretty darn good, especially considering the weather. Incidentally, the year after this was filmed, Perry Doolittle did a solo trip of his own. He actually became the first person to drive uh, all the way from Calgary to Vancouver. On this trip, they took the train for part of the way, but Doolittle was able to use his influence to gain access to some sections of highway that weren't actually finished yet, and skip a large chunk of the railway journey. Technically, the last sort of there was a chunk around, I believe, Lake Kootenay that took a ferry, but he did genuinely manage to actually drive on roads the whole way, which they were not able to do in 1925. So this is Kootenay National Park. It's another brand new sort of feature in the country at this point. It had only been opened 5 years previously. I don't believe you're still allowed to drive cars to the Sinclair Gap. I believe the highway now goes around it. But again, because of this big influx of auto tourism from the Northwestern United States, British Columbia got into the road tourism game really early and really quite aggressively. At this point, the province was full of private and public and provincial road building efforts. Um, Largely focused on interest at the time in the sort of Yukon and British Columbia gold rush history. So a lot of these highways through BC followed or were on original gold rush trails, and the province was actually working to do things like relocate gold rush era structures closer to the highways. To make for better tourist attractions. There was really an effort to kind of reshape the geography of the province to enable easy touring and lucrative touring for people coming from the United States. It was one of the big motivators for why BC was in this time period switching pretty aggressively to driving on the right because it saved time and energy at the border when Americans who were used to driving on the right would cross over into Canada where you drove on the left. So this whole landscape that they're driving through now is one that is at least partially being designed for what they're doing in a way that nothing else we've seen in Canada thus far has been. There are actually some fairly major highway projects, rarity for Canada, done in this period that actually no longer exist. There was so much enthusiasm for tourist highway building. There was kind of a bubble of tourist highway building in the 1920s and early 1930s that kind of fell apart with the Great Depression. And several of these routes were essentially semi-abandoned or kind of decayed from full-blown highways back down into single or small double-lane rural roads over the course of the 1930s. This is again one of those few shots where you see a little bit of extra traffic on the highway and possibly a car number three. This part, I believe, at least was some of the highway that was more fully finished when Doolittle did it in 1926. It all got built over. And I believe it's at this stop we see a bit more elaborate maintenance work being done on the car. They've got a smaller team of mechanics this time, fewer hangers on. And I believe we'll see in a second, they actually entirely swap out the front axle. Yeah, there we go. He's carrying it along. This is a not uncommon problem in cars of the state, especially economy cars. Fords and Chevrolets both had axle problems. And it would be substantially more difficult to swap out a full axle and wheel combo than it would be just a couple wheels, but they had to do it at least a few times. And here, at least, Flickenger appears to be driving for some of it. Sorry, Scrymgeour rather appears to be driving, but who knows how much of this is staged. Some really spectacular bridge driving here. So the Connaught Tunnel had just about been renovated. It was built in 1916 originally, and proved to be extremely dangerous. There were several major tunnel collapses. The effort to renovate it that finished in 1925 had killed several of the workers on it. So it may have been they were routed through here to a degree. Some cameraman humor here. I'll let it speak for itself. They may have been routed through this tunnel basically to show off that there was a new, better Connaught tunnel, unlike the old one that tended to fill with poisonous gas or collapse on people working on it. Lots of small and extremely picturesque railway towns in this part of the country. It's intriguing the degree of very seemingly unrestricted access they got from the railways. It really seems like they could just kind of hop on and off as they saw fit. Somebody steals his hat. Some of these shots, it feels like they were waiting for a still image. You know, that the you can clearly tell some of these people have not been on film very often and are a little camera shy. Okay, now this is actually really interesting. I don't know if these um, cowboys essentially are this, but at this time period, there were certain parts of BC where the provincial government actually employed um, horse riders and sort of out of work cowboys to ride along the highway essentially for photo ops and to provide local color. I think it was more up in the mountains, more northerly, but it was certainly a well-established thing for a large chunk of the 20s and 30s that there were dedicated provincial tourism cowboys who were just there to kind of add flavor, which is absolutely wild. It's also cool that they head through Fraser River here. Some of the oldest Canadian driving footage we have, or at least the oldest footage we have that was taken from a moving car in Canada. A large chunk of it was actually filmed on the Malahat roadway outside of Victoria, but there's several undated segments that were filmed in Fraser Canyon. So this is an area that's really been a kind of a scenic drive for as long as there has been scenic driving in Canada. It's an area that's been very well traveled, of course, by train, but also by car for as long as it's been feasible to have cars going through this kind of very rough and rugged and accidented terrain. Got to show off the headlights. Vitally important to establish that your car has electric headlights at a time when that was a fairly regular thing to see as a paid extra instead of something you got stock. Though, for what it's worth, there was a huge third party manufacturing scene around, for instance, giving your Ford less terrible headlights, or a dashboard heater, or a better roof, or springs that didn't squeak. So this is, I believe, one of the Lillooet suspension bridges. There's still a suspension bridge at Lillooet, and there's been one since almost, or at least a bridge of some kind, almost since the 1860s. I'm not entirely clear where this one is, and I've had some kind of conflicting claims and assertions from people from the area about which bridge this is. Because crucially, the original Lillooet suspension bridge was supposed to be large enough to take the weight of a car, and this is definitely not that. Yeah, they would have been, especially in the downhill sections, this car would have been racing along at speeds that would have not been feasible except on a racetrack anywhere else in the country. And a great little bit of analog railway communications technology coming up here. It's safe to say that the Model T would not be able to seriously outrun a steam locomotive um, under any circumstances, except maybe a very steep downhill. So what we're going to see here, actually, this is one of those dedicated tourist highways, sort of running parallel to the railway that also paralleled older Gold Rush pioneer routes, and that Perry Doolittle would take in his crossing of BC a year later. So this is a part of the country that was Gold Rush days being very actively worked on. And another interesting thing, an informational plaque. This is a very new concept at the time. These were really pioneered by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada on the West Coast and slowly spread their way east. And a lot of them were built, a lot of the sort of the very first series were built specifically for this big boom in gold rush themed tourism in this part of Canada. I believe I did some research. This particular historical plaque and the big rock it's on are no longer there. They were moved about a block away, and that site is now occupied by a gas station, because of course it is. And now they do kind of their final run along the rails after, well, they'd be going on 30 plus days of driving at this point, probably longer. And they reach Vancouver on day 40. Um, It's worth mentioning the trip actually ended properly in Victoria, where there was a big kind of wrap party, but they went to Victoria by ferry because they figured we crossed in the mainland. We don't need to do Vancouver Island as well. Now, the ending of this film is kind of abrupt. There's some editing weirdness that makes me think they've cut out some of the credit segments. But it's worth noting this crossing was actually fairly fast. The Haney and Wilby crossing in 1912 took 52 days. The Ford team managed it in 40, which is pretty good. Their claim that they were the first to cross under their own power is true. The car did drive itself the whole way. The first self-powered crossing wouldn't happen until 1948, with a vehicle doing all the driving. It was actually by motorcycle. The one thing I don't really buy here is their claims about sort of a lack of stoppages and breakdowns. Again, we never see how many times they had to get out and push. There's definitely some bending of the figures here for advantage. The speed I've seen quoted in a few places is roughly 120 miles a day, which is pretty good for the time period. It's not great, but all in all, there's a lot of little details I'd love to know more about, but probably never will know more about this particular trip. And of course, they end it having started by dipping the front wheels or the rear wheels into the Atlantic. You've got to end it by dipping the front wheels into the Pacific. We'll see that in a second. Yeah, I don't buy four punctures. I've seen the figure of 11 entire wheel changes for the whole trip quoted elsewhere. I do not believe that the crappy 1920s tires lasted 4,794 miles, only needing to be replaced four times. Do not buy that for a second. But it's a pretty darn impressive trip. You did it, Scrymgeour. You made it. I don't know for how much of it you made it, but you made it. And now you can pat yourself on the back. And the final crowning glory, the last shot of this is just hysterical because of course somebody's dog got into the shot. They didn't do another take. No, they whoever the local dealer was who drove it into the Pacific was, I'm doing this once. It's misty. I don't care if there's a dog in the way. That's a wrap. We made it. Wrap party. So that is across Canada with Ford. Um, like I said, we know a lot of little individual details. There's some huge unknowns about it. I really need to shout out to Mark Richardson, whose book Drive Across Canada sort of demystified a lot. He did some really stellar newspaper research to find a lot of these details. And if there's sections where there's not a lot of detail, it's because we just don't know because nobody at the time recorded it. But I'd certainly love to answer some questions if people have them.
Thank you, Dumaresq, for that interesting talk. I love seeing the footage of 1920s Canada in every province. I think it was a really special promotional effort by Ford.
Oh yeah,
And just thinking about built Ford tough before that was a an expression or a motto. So thank you.
no
Highly
worries.
interesting. And I think it's another great topic that showcases the areas of history that are adjacent to rail history.
Yeah.
That is being Canadian automotive history. So fascinating for me, fascinating for our audience, I'm sure. So for everyone listening, If you'd like to leave a question for Dumaresq in the Q&A section, just insert it there and I will field them and ask them. So we have a couple already. Dumaresq, this first one is from Lynn Deachman, and she references from the footage the Quebec bridge that you said collapsed.
Mhm.
Is it the one that was used to make iron rings for Ontario professional engineers? Do you know that?
I want to say yes, that rings a bell. I'm not a bridge expert, so don't quote me on this, but if I'm recalling my history of this particular bridge right, they started it in about 1906 or so and had multiple different, I think two separate collapses and two separate teams of engineers eventually come on the project. It was really kind of impressive that they finished it at all. But it went dramatically over budget. It took way longer than it was supposed to. But credit where credit's due, we're still using it as a major highway bridge more than 100 years later. So when they did fix all the problems, they fixed them. As for the Ontario College of Engineers rings, that I don't know off the top of my head.
Thanks for that. Lynn also adds a comment. She says how impressed and how nimble the Ford was over those Northern Ontario roads,
Yeah.
four-wheeling back in the day. I actually had a similar thought, thinking about my Ford F-150 going over those roads would be challenging enough, let alone a 1926 Model T.
Yeah, it was very much one of the other than the extremely low price, one of these cars would have cost give or take 375 $400 at that time. So it was the cheapest and the most popular car in Canada effectively. But one of the real selling points and one of the reasons why Fords were so ubiquitous in Canada was because they're not necessarily very good cars. They're hard to drive. They're clunky in many ways, other than sort of engine and transmission. They're very unreliable, but they could take the kind of just appallingly bad conditions Canada had to offer. And this video, to its credit, or film, does a really good job of demonstrating why Ford's like the conditions that existed that necessitated a car being this absurdly tough and flexible and bendy. Um, yeah, they any car driven in Canada at this time, outside of a major city, was pretty much guaranteed to face some driving that would be ludicrously bad by today's standards, and this film shows that pretty well, I think.
Absolutely. It's a great advertisement for Ford about the durability of their product. So this next one, Dumeric, is a question from David Mackey. He notices that at one point during the trek through the Rockies, the car has white flags. His question is, were they treated as an extra train? And before you answer, Demeric, for our audience, typically white flags on trains, they usually denote an extra train that is not on the timetable. So could you speak to the flags that appear on the car itself?
To the best of my knowledge, I believe that's correct. We know that the sort of Canadian National Railways and primarily Canadian Pacific were sort of equal co-partners in this venture and really didn't quite roll out the red carpet for Ford, but gave them a lot of permission. So, as somebody who doesn't know very much about train scheduling in the 1920s, my assumption would be that yes, it was treated as an extra. It would have been handled and scheduled and planned around exactly as if it was a full scale train, and that would track certainly with the latter half of the trip, especially where whatever schedule they'd planned initially had long since fallen apart because of the bad weather on the prairies. It would make total sense for them to be, fit into the schedule wherever they could fit.
Yeah, I think that's a fair presumption, and I would say the same. Thanks, David, for the question. And Demeric, last one. This one's from an anonymous attendee, and they say, "Awesome. Has there been an attempt to recreate the trip now in more modern times?"
Not to my knowledge, no. There have been quite a few Trans Canada drives since. Like I said, the first full Trans Canada drive under vehicle power was done by, I'm forgetting his name off the top of my head, by British guy in 1948 who did it on a Second World War vintage messenger motorcycle. And he actually drove along the tracks for a large part of it in 48. With somewhat less permission to do so than CN Rail. He did a lot of fence hopping in places and things like that. But I believe every subsequent, there was a full-blown actual on-road, no railway track crossing in 1952. I'm thinking off the top of my head, that date may be wrong. But no, to the best of my knowledge, nobody's ever attempted something like this because frankly, the Trans-Canada highway system made it obsolete. There's no reason why you couldn't do it. A lot of the rails fundamentally covering the Halifax to Vancouver trip still exist. I think the difficulty you'd probably have nowadays is remapping the trip to be able to do the same hops on and off. It would be a question of how accurately do you want to follow the original itinerary, which includes several spots where they backtrack or have to stop and wait for several days, versus do you parallel the rails, do you ride on the rails? But the infrastructure certainly exists to do it. But other than modern cannonball run style sort of speed crossings of the continent, of which those get done every year, often for charity, I don't know of any other mixed sort of car railway crossings like this since.
Jameric, if I can jump in there,
Mhm.
uh, as a former automotive historian, I do want to point out if you want to drive across Canada in a vintage car with other people, the National Association of Automobile Clubs of Canada still does regular cross-country tours.
They
They call it the
do.
Canadian Coasters, and they've been doing it, I think, since '67. And back for the centennial, they did a big cross-country tour. Now, of course, we have Newfoundland, so it's a little bit of a longer journey than what we had in 1925, but it's still done regularly, and there are still folks out there that do this in Model Ts in modern times. So if you're inspired, it's still a thing. I don't think they use any rails, but it's still an active hobby that happens every few years. I think the last was in 2022, but anyway, if you're interested, it still happens. So you too can drive across Canada in a Model T. Anything else you want to wrap up with here, Demeric? Otherwise, we will let everyone have a great holiday season before they join us for Royal Trains in January.
No, I think this film really speaks for itself. It's there's so much to unpack. You can use it to talk about so many different things. But thanks so much for having me and for the opportunity to share what we've learned about this wacky, kooky hour of film.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining us and have a great holiday season. Happy New Year. And we look forward to seeing you again for our 2026 Second Tuesday talks.